can just edit that bit out. So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this talk today. It's really nice to see so many people. Nice to see some familiar faces, and always great to meet some new ones as well. So we're going to be talking a bit about EYP skills at work and how to use that advantage that it gives you. But first of all, I think it's useful to know who's giving a talk, so that you can understand where I'm coming from and what sort of has influenced what I'm saying. Obviously, I've had a lovely little introduction from Lena already, so I don't need to go into too much detail over this, but just to sort of give you some additional context. Yes, I started over 10 years ago in 2008. That's the oldest photograph of me that I could find online. That one's actually from 2011 even, so there was a point where I looked even more baby-faced than that. And so really I ended up doing EYP, from a very long time, and actually I kept doing it right through university and after I started work. So I have a Master's of Engineering from Queen's University in Belfast, and currently I work as a tech lead, which is kind of like a sort of management-esque position. So I've gone from being from purely having engineering duties to having management duties as well. And I work for a New York startup at the minute doing that. And I think one of the things that put the idea for this talk into my head was that for a lot of people, their overlap with EYP is like high school and university. But I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time at EYP sessions after I'd already started working. And that let me build up a lot of comparisons in my head between things that I was seeing in the office and things I was seeing at EYP and things that I saw that were working well and not working well. And over time, I developed this sort of feeling almost all the time at work where I was like, why is this thing with these professional adults not working as smoothly as the same thing that I've seen done with 16 and 17-year-olds speaking English as a second language? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that kind of thing. So that's the kind of, that's where I'm coming from with wanting to share this stuff with you today. So we're going to be covering what I think some of those advantages that as EYP members and alumni are. Because I think being able to recognize those things is an important first step. And then we're going to look at how we can adapt some of those things for usage in like a professional environment in the office. I'm kind of assuming a sort of fairly office and meeting related career, but hopefully this will have stuff that's relevant no matter what field of work you're interested in. And then obviously, as I say, we'll have time for questions at the end. And any questions in the middle, I'll try to make sure to notice them and stop halfway if there's anything that comes up that doesn't make any sense. But otherwise, yeah, we'll have time at the end. So just before we really get started, a little disclaimer, because I realize that the title, like using your advantage and stuff, can sound a little bit sort of like putting yourself first, almost like a little selfish. And I guess something I just want to clear up is that these sort of skills and experiences and these qualities which you've accumulated and which we're going to be discussing, it's not meant to be like an ego exercise or, like a thing about us having like superior abilities because we've had these experiences. These are things that these aren't things that make us better than people we work with just because we've had the benefit of these experiences. And they're not exclusionary things. Everyone around you can benefit from these things being applied. So just like in an EYP context, like the judicious and mindful application of your skills can lead to a better experience and outcome for everybody, not just you. So like the advantages that we're going to unlock are not just personal benefits for you, but hopefully they'll be an advantage for everyone that you're working with. So yes, head start. So I believe that if you've been involved in EYP, you have developed skills that people who have only professional experience won't develop for many years after you. I believe that you'll have had experiences, regardless of if if you're sitting there with, one or two or many experiences under your belt, you'll have had moments of getting like a special insight into collaboration and personal dynamics. you may or may not really believe this. You might believe it in a kind of general way. Like people know like, oh yeah, EYP is useful for things and it gives you transferable skills, and you know that you come away from sessions feeling like you've learned something. But you might not sort of have a very sort of specific belief that it can apply. Or maybe you even have a bit of imposter syndrome where you could believe that this is true for somebody else, but it probably doesn't apply to you. So either way, I hope to demonstrate to your satisfaction today that whatever your experience, you're starting considerably ahead of most of the colleagues that you'll be working with, and that some of the skills that you take for granted are actually quite exceptional. So there's too many areas, I think, to cover them all. So what I've decided to do is pick a few different key ones that we'll spend some time focusing on. And as I say later on, we will discuss in more detail sort of different techniques and things that you can adapt. So the first one that came to mind, the inspiration for wanting to share this with you at all, is meetings. So I routinely watch professionals at very senior levels behave more disrespectfully and inefficiently than any delegates that I've ever worked with. Simple things that you would coach out of a committee very early, like two people talking at once, happen regularly. And people don't even seem to notice that this is happening around them. Your experience, even as a delegate, not necessarily as a chair, has prepared you to be a thoughtful and collaborative meeting participant. And your experience as a chair will have given you the ability to see these problems happening in a way that a lot of people with a sort of purely professional experience just won't. Like if you think back to your first time chairing, how able were you to actually notice those things going on? If you think back to your first time as a delegate, how sort of caught up in the moment and chaos of that conversation did you feel? Because that's a feeling that a lot of people keep with them in their professional lives. And I've found that that's one thing that's a kind of recurring blocker to improving processes at work, is that people aren't trained to observe their own communication. Like they don't actually notice that what's going on is inefficient. Like they don't have those years of experiences. Like, you know, as a chairperson, let's say, like balancing up the pros and cons of like, should I intervene? Should I not? Like, what's the best way to handle this? And I think something else that's unique to EYP like format discussions is you may be the person in the room with the most experience of building consensus, which is actually one of the most important parts of like a professional real world decision making process, and is probably the most overlooked and disregarded. Like winning an argument or being right is very, very seldom actually useful in the professional world. People are going to have their own agendas, their own office politics, goals from their own departments. It's almost never possible to really completely change these. So even if the person is wrong, that you can prove that to them and they'll just ignore you. So if you want to get anything done, finding something everyone can agree with is pretty much the only way that you can make it work. And does that sound familiar? Does that sound like any organization you may have worked with? And it's really like a fairly unique skill to have developed. So yeah, I mean, like if you think back to times when you've, you know, been a delegate and been frustrated that a conversation wasn't going well, you know, like did that fix itself? Did someone have to change something? Or, you know, times when you've been a chair and you've noticed a thing going off topic, and, you know, like how would you have handled that? Would you handle it differently now? Like these sort of things, I'm going to invite you to have a little think about, and sort of apply that context of professional work environment. Quite related to this is, I think, self-awareness, which is something that EYP actively trains for. And I think a lot of people achieve it very late or possibly never. A lot of people act instinctively and get angry about things. So I'll give you an example. Think about the last time that you were at like a party or something, and you got maybe a little bit carried away. You did something, or you said something silly or something hurtful, and you didn't really realize that you were doing it. Like that's what I mean by like acting instinctively, like in the moment. You know, whenever you're not watching yourself, you're just like acting as comes naturally. And a lot of people work like that all day. Like a lot of people never come out of that. And then, you know, I'd say then reflect on times when you had deliberately changed your behavior in an EYP context. So maybe the first time you chaired and you acted more confident than you really felt. You know, like that's a deliberate action. Times when you were aware of your behavior because you had to be very precise. Like for instance, if you're doing a very tense debrief and you need to make sure that every word that you say is like the correct word. Times when you were like trying to influence a committee, or maybe like a time that your committee was getting away from you, and in hindsight you realize that you were acting in the moment instead of taking a step back to be like, oh, what was my deliberate path out of that? And this like even thinking about that, thinking about like, is this a deliberate decision or is this an in the moment thing? I guarantee you does not happen for 90% of the professionals that you will work with in the course of your career. Like that is not a conversation that they will have in their head, and they will not have had that like training to like sit back and think like, right, okay, am I going to get upset with you in this meeting, or am I going to decide what is it I actually want to happen, and then base what I say according on that, even if it's not like necessarily what I believe or what I think is the best. Another thing that is like a constant EYP thing is feedback. So hopefully as a delegate, you've received this. Hopefully as a chair, you've received this. If you've ever been a VP or a president, hopefully you've received it. But here's something to think about. And this is one of the other things that made me want to give a talk about this. If you've ever watched a group of people work and made a note in a notebook about them that you intended to give as feedback at some point, like be it positive or negative, then you've already had more practice at being a manager than most managers have. So at 17, 18 or 19, right, you could have already had practice at doing something that most people do for the first time in their late 20s or early 30s. Isn't that crazy? Like I think that's significant. Like the last time that I got promoted to like a management position, I was told quite plainly, make sure you have regular meetings with the team and give them feedback. And I just have to wonder, like, what would I have made of that instruction if that had been given to me in isolation without years of evaluations and training on feedback, buddy group meetings? Like, what would I have done? Like, what would that have looked like? What would I have known to ask for clarification on that? Like, would I, in my senior management role, have given feedback about as well as a first-time chair? And based on some of the feedback I've received from managers, I can tell you that the risk of that is higher than you might think. That you might assume that you know, everyone else out there is like high flying and doing really well, and it's not possible for all of these managers that you'll encounter to be bad at giving feedback, but it actually is secretly possible. You secretly can be the one who knows more. So like if you think back on the first time that you gave somebody feedback and how long ago that was, and how you did it, and maybe if you felt a little bit awkward about the way it went, or you didn't really gather your information that well. Now imagine that you're like someone at work who gets like of your age who gets promoted and has to give that kind of feedback to somebody. You know, like that's the type of difference that we're talking about. Sort of rattling through these, but I want to sort of get through this and then move on to the sort of more concrete things that you can actually change and affect. Job interviews, I wanted to touch on this, not necessarily a sort of specific part of like the work life, but something that I think EYP gives you specific experience for. Writing applications to sessions is very similar to the process of like applying for jobs, and like the process by which you know, tailor what you're saying about your skills and abilities, and, you know, tune your CV or your resume, and the way you answer questions in the interview, you know, about your strengths and weaknesses and your experiences with certain things, are all skills that you will have been able to actually get practice at from writing EYP applications. I'll come back to this later on in more depth whenever I discuss sort of different techniques and things. But I just wanted to highlight that as another thing that you have some experience of, even if you might not consider it direct experience. Another thing that is, I think, it's not necessarily unique to us, but I think it's a special thing that we have. And a lot of people who've maybe just come from university directly, or have experience in like certain types of companies, won't have the same level of experience for this. Like EYP gives you that experience of working like asynchronously across different time zones with people who may speak your language as a second, third, or fourth, or maybe you're the one speaking, as a second language. And again, I think these are things that we take for granted, right? We're like, yeah, of course we do. That's normal. But even like simple things like remembering to say what time zone a meeting is in and remembering the time zone of your attendees, like you'd be amazed how many people just don't do that or have never thought about it. Like things like being familiar with how names sound in other countries and not having to alienate someone the first time you meet them by asking them, like by asking every person you meet, like, oh, how's that pronounced? Being able to trust someone, and I think this is I think one of the most important ones. Being able to trust someone who doesn't look or sound like you to do an excellent job, and without wanting to cast aspersions, I believe that this is something that a lot of people struggle with, particularly in companies where they outsource labor to other parts of the world. And I think that it's something special actually that EYP gives you that training to listen to what someone's actually saying rather than just hearing their accent. And also, like just exposure to different cultures, like experience with collaborating with people from different cultures, and also the experience with working in a sort of distributed remote way. No, that's something that everyone's having to learn, obviously, but if you've ever been involved in pre-session preparation, like particularly as a chair, or then you've already put a lot of thought into how you can get people engaged, plan activities, build an atmosphere, keep people on schedule without being face-to-face. So again, just like, and that's something that a lot of people are having to do for the first time this year. And many of us have been doing it, for years already. And then the last area that I sort of wanted just to cover sort of broadly, it's just about confidence in public speaking. And specifically, I mean, we all have, some experience, hopefully, of EYP giving you a platform for getting to sort of speak publicly and work on your confidence. And I hope we all have some experiences of that. The point that I think is sort of special about the EYP context of this is, so I remember finding public speaking very intimidating, and I think a lot of people probably could relate to that. I'm not saying that EYP helped me find like public speaking totally like easy and I didn't get nervous about it anymore, but I stopped finding it overwhelming, at least because of EYP quite early in my career. And so sometimes when people think about public speaking, they think about things like that sort of adrenaline rush feeling, like the uncontrollable handshaking. Sometimes people get like people who are even like quite good at public speaking, like get in front of the microphone or in front of the camera, and they kind of like have a blackout where they either don't remember what they meant to say, or after they finished speaking, the whole thing is like a blur to them and they don't remember it. So like I think those are feelings that probably a lot of us will recognize from like early or even current like public speaking experiences. But hopefully also a lot of us got practice during EYP to have exposure, and I think particularly overexposure to being made to speak publicly in a way that normalized it and helped to accelerate feeling more comfortable with it, particularly in a safe environment where everyone's kind of having to do it. Like I've noticed that a lot of people I've worked with, not just engineers, but like across the board, really struggle with this to this day, even after many years, some of them. And I think a large part of that is it's definitely a skill that you can practice in a professional environment. But I think what they missed was like the safe environment, like EYP, to get comfortable with it first. Like if your only opportunities to practice your public speaking are like, presenting to 500 employees, including the CEO, twice a year, that's not a good way to make yourself more comfortable, so that kind of like regular practice, overexposure, normalization of putting yourself out there is also, I think, something that was like pretty special to that experience. So I hope that you may now at least be open to being convinced that you have some tangible skills and qualities that are different to the experiences of your colleagues and the people you might be working with. So the question is then, how can we make the most of that? So especially if these are things that we take for granted, how can we move to a more deliberate way of recognizing these situations and adapting the tools and techniques that we have? So like, you may remember that you had a particularly effective debrief at some session where you used jelly beans to represent happy and sad feelings, or, you all close your eyes and listen to sad music, or calm music or something. And that's great, but like obviously knowing that was effective at like a Czech regional in 2016 is not going to directly help you to like calm down an angry chief product officer, or mend the fences between the user experience team and the search engine optimization team. So what I want to do is sort of break down some of those techniques, see how they work, and then rebuild them as things that we can use in like a sort of professional office environment. So we'll start with debriefing then, since that's the one I mentioned. The EYP techniques for this, there's a load of them. Jelly beans, I've mentioned, eyes closed, holding up fingers for how good your day was. In some professional environments, you may still encounter finger gestures that indicate how well people's days are going. Passing an object around that says when people get to speak, moving to a different room to discuss a particularly charged topic, going over like the facts, feelings in the future, all these kind of things. And the reason that we do these things is ultimately to improve the effectiveness of the team, right? You want to, you also want to make sure everyone's happy, and you want to smooth over any ruffled feathers, and you want to make sure that, you have 15 minutes from the end of team building till the start of committee work. So you want to make sure that nobody's crying, right? And like, that's, I think, part of how we think about it, but it's also about making sure the team is actually more effective at what they need to do, and that people can be honest with each other. And hopefully that you do this in a way that avoids blaming individuals. So problems with some of the EYP techniques is that obviously some of them are a bit sort of obvious. Some of them are a bit sort of too much like a game. You may struggle to get buy-in from people to take part in these things, particularly people who are used to not having anything like this. If you spring it on them, the reaction will be to get defensive and not engage with it. But there are some of these things that we can take, particularly if you think, okay, well, if we want to improve the team effectiveness, we want to allow people to be honest, and we want to avoid assigning blame. Like, how can we do that? And one of the ways that we do that is one of the tools that you can use to do that is a retrospective meeting, sometimes called a retro. And what that is after a set period of time, you take all the people who were involved in a certain project. It could be every week, 2 weeks, a month. So unlike a debrief, you can have these on a regular cadence, whereas with a sort of traditional debrief, you would only have them as and when needed. And the point of the retrospective then is that you get everybody to kind of brainstorm on how they felt about how the thing went. So the key points are discuss. You can use. I'll get to brainstorming techniques later, but there are modern versions of post-its and things. The key point is that you want to be discussing what went well, what went wrong, and what should change for next time. So I think a bit unlike the EYP version, dwelling on the past isn't what is necessarily useful here, but it's all about making sure that next time something different happens, like making sure that the lessons are actionable. So, for example, I might be in a retrospective meeting and say, oh, I felt really bad during this project. I didn't really know what I was doing. It was pretty confusing and frustrating. Like, that might well be the point that I want to make. But that point is not like the action item that should come out of that. Like, out of that, we need to identify like the cause of that. So, okay, if I felt whatever, why did I feel that way? Like, what actually caused it? And then what could be done differently to prevent it? So, that feeling of being confused and frustrated about the project could turn into an action like, okay, for the next project, the requirements have to be identified upfront and communicated to the team in writing, something like that, where you're taking something that can actually change particularly because in the professional environment, you often will struggle to get people to change their behavior in a generalized way. Like if you would say like, these requirements weren't very well communicated. Could you communicate them better next time? You'll get a big thumbs up and no change. So that's why making like sure that there's like actionable things is really useful for this. Yeah, because I think anyway, people often think of the debrief as a process by which we sort of like fix a team building problem or resolve an argument. And I think in the professional setting, the feelings become a little bit less important. And making sure that you have like a solution to prevent the thing from happening next time is usually more beneficial. And then a post-mortem is typically, this is more like, maybe more like what we would consider a debrief, in that a post-mortem only happens after something bad happens. And it's an opportunity to get people to, well, there's different ways of doing this. You could have a meeting, you can have a document that you contribute to asynchronously. Yeah, it could be a Slack channel, but basically the point of a post-mortem is to identify like almost like a timeline of, okay, for this thing that went wrong, when did we first notice it? Like, how did we find out about it? How long did it last? When did we fix it? If it's like a fault that you can fix. If it's an ongoing problem, then obviously you don't have a fault for it yet, or like a fix for it yet. And then with a post-mortem, you want to look at, okay, like what went well, like where did we get lucky? Which of our processes as a team worked well? What ultimately caused this problem without assigning blame? So like, you want to sort of trust that there's a process that you could have put in place other than just being like, oh yeah, this happened because Alastair's really bad at that part of his job. You want to maybe say that, oh yeah, this happened because we don't verify the changes that we make to the production environment on a Friday afternoon. You sort of want to frame it in a way that you can actually do something about it. And within that, then you can see that something like the facts, feelings, and future techniques that can kind of come across. And whenever you're having sort of retrospective meetings, maybe you can't use colored jelly beans to get people to come out of their shell, but there's plenty of that core idea of trying to expose somebody in a way where they're feeling comfortable to be honest with their feeling. You can achieve by having that kind of, we set the expectation basically in a meeting that it's going to be a blameless thing where people have to share. You also get some help, I guess, from the professional environment, because the expectation is that people are going to be at least civil to each other, hopefully, most of the time. Speaking of people hopefully being civil, and the friend that we often see lined up beside debriefs, feedback. So what I want, just as a note before I go into this, receiving feedback is a skill like all on its own, and I think the EYP experience that we've learned there can just sort of be directly applied. There's also an EYP feedback guide, which if you're interested is well worth reading, and I think all those fundamental rules still apply. Whenever you're giving feedback, you want to talk about things that you personally witnessed, talk about the impact that it had on you as opposed to something that you perceive it to have had on somebody else. You want to be talking about specific actions rather than generalizing. Like, that's, all those things still hold completely true. What I would like to sort of narrow in on here specifically is sort of focusing on EYP specific experiences and then sort of mapping those to things that you might see in a professional environment. So apart from all those things about like nonviolent behavior and sort of situational actions and impacts and things, the way in which we typically interface with feedback in an EYP setting is through like a buddy group meeting, feedback that happens ongoing throughout the session, and the evaluation that you get at the end of the session. And the reasons for that obviously are so that whenever people do something that is good, we want to tell them that it was good. You want to reinforce those behaviors and give people like the positive like energy and the positive reinforcement, like, yes, that was a good thing to do, keep doing that. And you want to also be able to highlight, well, actually this could be improved. This could have been done better. You want to be able to sort of identify any problems that the person's having. If you're the one giving the feedback, you want to be able to identify problems that the person giving you feedback has with you. Also, you want to be able to assign certain rewards to people based on merit. So in an EYP context, I think what that really lines up with is you get a good evaluation, and then that good evaluation may influence sessions whenever selection panel time rolls around. Obviously, it's more relevant, obviously, to professional world, but I think I'm going to draw a comparison between those sort of formal evaluations at the end of a session and the annual review process that employees go through. Obviously, as part of an annual review, then you may be looking at like a promotion or a pay raise or something. So like I'll start back with buddy group meetings. So the version of that you would see in a professional environment would be more like a one-to-one meeting. And what I think is interesting is that it's actually the same mindset as like a buddy group meeting, except that they're individual and they're probably weekly as opposed to at the end of every day. And the goal is the same. Let's say the manager is the vice president, and the person being managed is the chair. The goal is the same. You want the chair to be able to set the agenda for the things they want to talk about, and then also give them feedback based on the performance that you've seen throughout the day, based or since the previous meeting over the course of the week in this case. And like with a buddy group meeting, you might choose to have this like over a coffee, it can be pretty informal, relaxed setting. So, I mean, if you take a moment to reflect on maybe buddy group meetings that you can remember, like the atmosphere that they had, the ways in which they helped you, maybe you didn't get the help that you needed and how that made you feel, like all that experience that you have with that perfectly rolls over into one-to-one meetings with your manager. And I think that's interesting as well, because a lot of people kind of don't know what to do if they're one-to-one meetings. It's a time that's carved out in their calendar that they don't know really what it's for. I would also say if you end up in an industry where these aren't common, or that you don't like have a regular one-to-one meeting, I would encourage you to push for them to be a thing, for them to be regular, because it's also just, as with buddy group meetings, a great time to sort of socialize with the people sort of up and down the management chain from you. Similarly speaking, skip level, I can't really think of a good analogy for this in EYP, but it's something that performs all the same like goals. It adheres to the same rationale as the reason that we do, the buddy group meetings and feedback. And a skip level is a meeting that you would have not with your manager, but with your manager's manager. And that's a great way to, so from the manager's perspective, it's a great way to make sure that things are going okay. You can imagine it like, a VP coming in to check up on your delegates to make sure that you're treating them right. And it's also a great way for, let's say the delegates to be able to raise up problems to the VP and be like, oh, this is, I don't know what the chair told you, because we never said we'd be finished at that particular time, like that kind of thing. And something else which I think is maybe slightly analogous to training that we do before sessions really start, but not necessarily, is sharing of best practices. So we tend to think of feedback as a thing that, like, okay, you got to store up all the negative things that this person did, and then you're going to wait till they ask for feedback, and then you're going to like pop the balloon and like list off all the times that they impacted you negatively. And that, I mean, you can do that. And similarly, you can store up all the things that you think they did well, and then like give them like the praise parade at some point. But another technique that you can use is just the sharing of best practices. So this could be like a regular meeting where people discuss things that they do that work well for them. And it's kind of like if you can imagine that negative feedback for someone might come across as a, do as I say, not as I do, then a best practice sharing meeting is like a do as I do. Because you're instead of telling someone what you think will be more impactful, or sort of trying to coerce people into working in a different way, you're showing them like, okay, here's the things that we do that work well. So, I mean, to try and give you a specific example of that, in an engineering context, that would typically be something like the sort of the styles and the practices that we use for, particular languages or products. technical framework things that we do, things that impact our day to day. You could also imagine that something like, like a style guide for written stuff, like a best practice, ways of formulating documents, ways of, organizing master plans for complicated events, all those sort of things where you might want to say to people like, okay, instead of saying your way of doing that is bad, you can instead say, here's the way that we did it that worked really well. And you can kind of deliver the same information that way. Annual reviews, I won't spend too much time on, I guess, other than just that it's a thing to be aware of, because quite a lot like evaluations after sessions, there's often considerable like heel dragging on the part of the managers who have to deliver these to do them. And they often take a while and need some cajoling to actually get delivered. And there's also a kind of like sort of dance to them, which is complicated. Like as the person being reviewed, you'll probably have to submit a review of yourself, which can be quite painful, because it's very difficult to fill out a document with like, here's all the reasons why I did my job well this year. And your manager is obviously going to have their own feeling about that. That's going to come back down to you. So like that's not a super it's not super similar to evaluations in that sense. But what's important about it is that you can use your experience from being evaluated, one, to like interpret the feedback that you get. You can use your experience from giving evaluations to sort of understand what it means to give someone that kind of like formal feedback at a regular cadence, as opposed to the sort of impromptu one that you give them more regularly. You can use your EYP experience to understand the impact that has, the kind of phrasing you can use, the kind of things that you'd want to pull on or like draw on to be like, oh yeah, well, I'm giving this person this kind of rating, and here are the things that they did. Very much like it's like if you've written these for delegates, then you have more experience than like a first-time manager who's never done EYP. So this is one that I've been looking forward to getting to, and I think this might be one of the more useful ones. And it relates back to my gripes about meetings and people not behaving in meetings the way I would maybe expect them to. So this kind of thing would also probably form the core of like a committee work module. So the things that we would like, if I'd been asked for like EYP committee work techniques on how to manage discussions and make them more effective, my mind would go to things like body language and positioning in the room, providing structure for the conversation. And I give them the example there of the classic grid with the problems and the ideas and the aims and the solution and the clauses, and that's a great structure. I use it all the time. Asking like the question why repeatedly to get to the root of some issue. Using an issue tree to identify the subtopics or problems. If anyone's not familiar with an issue tree, it's where you take like a core problem that you maybe can't solve and you divide it into smaller problems that maybe you can solve. For example, like if your problem is people don't take enough public transport, and you think that that's too big a problem to solve, you can look at a sub problem of it that might be like public transport is expensive. As you sort of break it down into things that become more and more approachable. And obviously the reason that we do that sort of thing is because we want to have a structured discussion instead of just chaos. We want to get everyone's ideas out without one person dominating, which is a particular problem in a professional environment, in all honesty. You want to be able to cover all the issues in depth and in a logical order. You want to make sure that you're having the correct conversation. Like something I always used to say to chairs is like, I don't mind if your delegates are having a conversation that's like, if their ideas are bad, that's fine. As long as they're having the right conversation, as long as they're on topic, then like that's their ideas and it's fine. So yeah, like keeping it on topic. And then reaching decisions in a reasonable amount of time and effort, and producing the outcome of the discussion in a reasonable amount of time and effort. So obviously, let's say you're in a meeting and one of the colleagues is being too verbal or being too aggressive. You can't exactly use the old EYP classic of standing behind them until they quieten down. So that's why I wanted to sort of think about different ways that you can approach these things. So one of my first pieces of advice would be just to have fewer meetings. And this is maybe a place where your EYP training will let you down. There's definitely a tendency in almost every workplace I've been in, including EYP, to have a meeting for everything. And I would like to recommend to you that for things that can be done, like email or Slack or whatever, to move them to there. A lot of the time, discussions are difficult because meetings should only really be held, like discussions should only really be had if there is an issue that needs to be sort of teased out and then a decision made at the end of it. A lot of the time, like particularly in committee work, the reason it's difficult is that people don't know what they want and they don't know what they're talking about. And what you have the benefit of in a professional environment is if people rock up to your meeting and they don't know those things, then you can just postpone the meeting and say, okay, well, we need to come back. You go and read this and then come back. Or preferably you don't have a meeting until things get complicated enough that you actually have to discuss it. Like a good rule of thumb for that can be like, you can discuss these things in text on Slack, but if you notice like more than like 3 questions in a row, for instance, coming up, then that's a good time to jump on a call instead. Similarly, like issue trays, still perfectly valid, but I think the difference is that you wouldn't build that as part of a conversation, or like you wouldn't have that as part of a discussion where you're getting the delegates to kind of elicit it. You have the benefit of being able to do that offline and provide the content for it yourself. And similarly, I would say that a tool that you can use is having like a checklist for people before meetings, not necessarily a literal checklist, but that if you're having a meeting, you know, are these all the people who need to be there? Is there anyone who doesn't need to be there? Have these people all prepared sufficiently to discuss the thing that we're going to discuss? Are we empowered, you know, in the company to actually make the decision we need to make? And do we have like all the resources that we need, like having made that decision? And similarly, having an agenda for the meeting. I will, if I have the power to, typically reject a meeting that comes onto my calendar that doesn't have a clear explanation of this is what the meeting's about, this is what we're going to discuss, this is what we're hoping to get out of the meeting. A lot of the time people view meetings as like an alternative to thinking. So they're like, oh, we need to sort this out, let me put a meeting in your calendar. It's like, no, that's not how it works. If you want to have a meeting, you need to know what the meeting's going to be about. If you're on the receiving end of a meeting that doesn't have an agenda, what's nice about that is that there's no, because obviously I understand that not everyone's going to be in the position of being able to set the agendas for these things. There's nothing to stop you from like pointing out during a meeting that you're not sure what the agenda is and asking for one, because an agenda is a perfectly valid thing to ask for, and people will struggle very badly to argue to you that they don't need an agenda for their meeting. But hopefully you do get the opportunity to run the meetings, to own the meetings. And that is kind of like the replacement for the body language and positioning stuff in a lot of ways. The more like professional context work meetings that you have, the more you'll notice that, and this isn't always the person who actually sets up the meeting and who should be the organizer of it, but quite often you'll have a person who naturally just assumes the role of this is my meeting and I'm the one who sets the agenda. I'm the one who sort of dictates when we start and finish. You know, I'm the one who's going to be chasing up on the actions that get taken. And that can be a bad thing, honestly, if you're not the one who should be running the meeting. I have plenty of meetings where that happens and it's kind of difficult to deal with. But whenever you are doing it rightfully so, it's actually very powerful, because it means that you can actually, unlike with chairing, but using all the same like confidence and assertiveness and putting on your confidence that you would use to be like an active chair and actively intervene, you are perfectly within your rights to share a meeting, you know, to tell people that they're off topic, to refocus things, to set the start time, set the end time. And actually, like, I think as a young new employee, like as a junior person in a company, it's really hard to actually feel like you're allowed to do that, especially if there are people in that meeting who are more senior than you. But seniority is more like you know, that you can be the most junior person on the team and still be given the task of being in charge of it or managing it, because it's not like a rank. And one of the things I'd like people to, you know, maybe think about is how confident you maybe feel as a chair or a vice president or an editor, and like how much you feel like you've got it, and like kind of like swagger that you have when you're walking around, versus if you're going into a meeting at work and you're feeling really timid and feeling like you don't got it. Like where that difference comes from, because honestly, you can use all the same like confidence that you got over there and just use it to have that same kind of authority and assertiveness. For managing discussions, particularly if you want to have something like brainstorming or multiple people giving ideas and stuff, there are loads of really cool tools for that at the minute that replace post-its in the traditional model. There's one that I really like that we use a lot called HackMD, which is kind of like having a Google Doc open. And what we'll often do in a meeting, if we need to actually brainstorm stuff, is make one of those, everyone joins it, and then you can just sort of type and you can see what everyone else is typing. It's a lot like having a Google Doc shared, but it feels a lot faster, and you can do the formatting in Markdown. So it's like default unformatted. So it's like instant, as opposed to like Google Docs, which has like that slight bit of lag you can notice sometimes. And then there's Trello, which I'm sure is not unfamiliar to many people, sort of like columns and card based system. But we use that all the time. We use that for our retrospectives. It's a really great way of doing that, because then you can group things together, and you know, we have like a column for each grouping that we want to have. Miro is a tool which you may or may not have heard of. It's like a visual whiteboard thing, which is also great for brainstorming, because what you can do, for instance, is put, let's say you have like a visual thing, not necessarily a document that you want to brainstorm on. You can put that on this interactive whiteboard, and people can put little virtual post-it notes on it. Another technique that you can use, and this sort of replaces, I think, the let's say that one of the most common sort of staple committee work structures you might have is like this grid in your room with all the problems, and then the ideas and the aims and solutions, and then finally the clause, right? Like I think that's a kind of, in some way, shape, or form, that's a thing that would be familiar to a lot of people. If you try to pull that into a meeting, you will struggle, partly because of the size and the scope of that. But if you have some shared documentation for your team, then you can use the exact same approach. You can break up, you know, let's say you have a Confluence or an internal wiki, or even just Google Docs. You know, you can have like a page per column of that grid if you want. So you can have a page on your Confluence for all the problems. And then each row on that grid, which would have been just like a discussion point, well, that can become like a meeting. You know, you can kind of take that same idea and reorganize it. I guess what I'm really saying is that a lot of that can be done offline and can be done with sort of structured things. You also, to manage discussions, will want something, a luxury you don't have in committee work is being able to defer decisions. I'll touch more on this when I talk about consensus building, which I will move on to actually quite quickly, just to not take up too much of your time. And also choosing your battles, another luxury that you don't necessarily have in an EYP setting, but you can tap into your frustration at having to get everything perfect for a committee, for a resolution, and realize that in the professional environment, it's more of a long game, and you can kick that can down the road if you have to for a lot of things. But hopefully we can do some consensus building. So consensus building and people getting confused. This is one of the big problems I see. George Bernard Shaw did not actually say this quote, but I do quite like it. And you'll see this all the time. Two people talking to each other who are not actually listening to each other, and they don't know that they haven't listened. Like, this is like the number one thing. And I think this is one of the things where, as a person with chairing experience, you have some of the most power, because you have training to notice when that's happening, and you have training to intervene when it's appropriate, to, you know, refocus a discussion back to something. So, you know, the things that we might use in EYP are, you know, like making sure everyone's on the same topic, sharing knowledge, again, through things that are maybe like too childish to use in an office, you know, explaining like it's a 5-year-old, drawing it on a napkin. Although there's things like devil's advocate and concept checking questions, which are still perfectly relevant. Concept checking questions being like, you don't ask, do you understand? But you ask, you know, what time are we meeting? You know, so their answer tells you they understood the question. You want to obviously make sure that people all understand the same thing. And you want to make sure that anytime someone's confused, it's obvious. And the other thing is that you want to reach an outcome that's acceptable for everyone. So that's where I come back to, like, it's not about sort of winning and losing in this context, because like if you make an argument and you win, and this person has some red lines that come down from their manager or whatever that they can't break, it's like, well, you know, good, well done on winning the argument, but you know, we're not going to take your points on board. So things that you can do, offer opportunities for things to be re-explained constantly. In a professional environment, even more so than in like an EYP environment, where you may have seen delegates being like unwilling to admit that they don't know things. Imagine that plus like 30 years of pride and a title with like the word senior in it. Like, people will not openly admit that they've misunderstood or don't know something. So if you offer the opportunity, you know, for things to be re-explained, you re-explain them without being asked. I would also say that one of the best techniques that you can carry over is like active listening and knowing when to refocus someone on a conversation, because this is a skill that like takes years of training, and it's a skill that we get years of training in, and people just don't really have that so much outside. So by that, I mean like paying attention to what people are saying, noticing if I say one thing and you say something else, and I think that you've said something different than I said, like noticing that kind of mistake. Because a lot of people tend to talk in quite sort of imprecise ways where they just kind of coast over little things like that, and it can really grow into a big problem. A technique that you can use almost directly from EYP would be like an impact train. An impact train, for those who aren't familiar, would be that if you're discussing a potential solution, you say, well, okay, if we do this, then it also has this impact, which also has this impact, and you sort of build them all together. There's a professional world version of that would be something like an impact assessment, which again is something that you can actually do sort of offline and bring back to a subsequent meeting rather than having people discuss at the time. So what's great is that, you know, if you get to a point in your discussion where there's like a, you know, two different options on the table and people can't agree, you can say, well, okay, that's great. We'll take those away. We'll look at the impact of both of them, and then we'll come back and then you can pick. And similarly, a reverse issue tree, which again, if you're not familiar, is a committee work technique where you can say, okay, these are the issues that we can't agree on, you know, but let's, you know, take it back a step to like the last common point that we can agree on, you know. So maybe we can't agree on, if the classic example is like, should we give benefits to the people who do the thing we want them to do, or should we tax the people who do the thing we don't want them to do? And like committees can never agree on that kind of thing. But then you take it back a level to like, okay, well, we all agree that we want there to be a financial benefit or drawback. Like, you know, you take it back to that point they can agree on. And then particularly what you can do in a professional environment is use that experience of like pulling people back up to the last point they agreed on. But whereas in a committee work environment, you would then slowly march them back down towards one of the options. In a professional environment, what you can do is focus on the bit that they at least agree on. Like, okay, we signed a contract for this product that we have to start using next month, and we want it to do these two things, even if we can't agree on like the implementation of either of them. And then you can defer that until later. And quite often that's going to involve, if the people in that meeting can't make that decision, you can go above them to other people. And also something which I think people are uniquely not prepared for is changing your mind. I think that's a skill that EYP teaches you that people in work often just don't even think about. And it's funny because it's one of the things I used to say to the delegates most often. It's like, you know, if you're coming in here, be prepared to change your mind. And whenever I walk into a committee room, like I think about that, and that's where my mind's at whenever I'm watching people debate. But whenever I'm watching people at work discuss or argue about things, I never get that feeling. I never get the sense that anyone's actually like prepared to march back on something that they're thinking. And I think it would be, I think work environments would be nicer if more people carried over that sort of skill that we've developed. So there are two more areas that I want to touch on. I will touch on them just quickly. So EYP techniques for team building. As you can imagine, a lot of these aren't really appropriate to try and pull into professional environment. But what we do have is a lot of experience with team building knowledge and theory and emotional intelligence. And that's something that a lot of people are going to lack who haven't. I mean, if you remember back, if you reflect back to the first time you learned some team building theory or were exposed to team building, that was probably all new material, even though some of it's intuitive, like being able to formalize it is certainly a new thing. And then you can think back to maybe the first time when you were sharing, when you noticed a certain action or behavior from someone that you could associate with a certain step of their development and like a cohesion as a group, like that kind of thing. Being aware of that and actually being like able to see it happening in front of you is something that like consultants get paid for. You know, like that's actually a monetizable skill. And if you still have it and you're good at it, you know, go make that your job. Because a lot of people that you'll encounter just will not have that. So I would say that like the way in which you can really take your team building experience with you is not so much like you know, an energizer at the start of your meeting. Like I don't think Haroon from the ops team is going to have like a buy-in for that. But just using like on an ongoing way, like your experiences with these things. Because the other great thing about a professional environment is like in EYP, you got to get that stuff done in a day. You know, like you have a few hours to gel these guys together. And in a work environment, it's a marathon. You know, you have months to do it, and it can be baby steps, which is also why like normal social interactions are like probably the best way of doing it. But I will say that if all else fails and you find yourself on a team where they're doing the kind of cliched office team building things that people complain about, like a barbecue day, and then people are throwing axes, you can also help out a lot by using your experience in being out of your comfort zone like that and just going with it, you know, like channel your inner chairperson, be willing to look foolish. Because if you can unlock that, like for that team, even if that's not the sort of like corporate team building that you would have planned, you can really help people have a good time just by like allowing them to have a good time. And then lastly, I wanted to talk just quickly about interviews and applications. So, and I think I'll boil it down to like the main point that I wanted to make here, which was that whenever you're applying to a session, you are always applying very bespokely for that session. You're tailoring your application to how much you want to be in that city at that time, with that session theme and that session motto. And you know, you want to work with those sponsors or you know, the patron. You know, it's always really specific. And whenever you're writing about like your experiences, you know, like, oh, what are your strengths as a chairperson? You'd be like, well, this session last year I did this and I did that, and this problem I had in my committee, and this is how I solved it. You know, and if you're asked on an EYP application, what are your like weaknesses? You'll be like, oh, well, I'm bad at timekeeping, but I want to work on that at this session. And, you know, here's the ways that I want to improve on it. And that's all really, really good. Now, you put those same people and you ask them to apply for a job, and they send the same application to every single one of them. And I just like, that would be the thing I would say to take away from it. Treat job applications and treat that level of tailoring that you would do like the same way you would do for a session. In particular, focusing on your personal contributions. So the best example I can give for you of that is, let's say you were at, name a session. Let's say you were at Pilsen and you're writing an application for another session, and you want to be like, okay, I was chairing at Pilsen. You would never write something like, well, I was chairing at Pilsen and this was the session motto, and just leave it at that. But you would be amazed at the number of people who, whenever describing their professional experience in a job interview or application, will say, I worked at this company and they do this. you know, without ever actually going into detail on what they do. So you say, okay, well, what did you do? And they say, oh, our team did this. It's like, oh, great. What did you do? And people seem to get stuck on that. Whereas whenever it's like an EYP thing, people find it really easy to be like, oh, well, you know, I talked to the vice president and I got advice on a different structure. And then I took the delegate, you know, on a coffee break and I gave them some feedback. You know, people find it really easy to describe exactly what they did for that kind of thing. And for some reason, I find that people, like professionally, even very experienced people, just are totally unable to often like actually describe what they personally did. And that sort of situation that you were in, the action you took, and the result that it had is the best framework I would recommend for tailoring that. And also just recognize that you have a lot of experience in writing applications for things and for getting accepted for things that a lot of people don't have. And just to use that sort of confidence and that way that you would have written things like with you whenever you're applying for things. So in summary, and I apologize for going a little bit over time, I hope that this has helped you to recognize some of the skills that you have, to be mindful of your environment, to be deliberate in your actions. It's given you some inspiration, at least, on how to adapt different committee work tools that you may have. And actually, I don't know if you can see my camera or not, but what I have here is my How the European Union Works book, which was one from 2008, which is so old, it's now accurate again, because this 2008 edition has 27 member states. Yeah, so some inspiration for taking the things that you have and reusing them in a different way. And I have this here, by the way, because I was reusing committee work materials to help me think about work things. And just to help yourself and let that help everyone around you. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. I put my LinkedIn there if people want to contact me there. Afterwards, I've also put my Instagram if you want to see pictures of bread. And special thanks, obviously, to Laura, Helena, and also to my buddy Fahad for sharing some ideas with me. So I guess now we can go to, I know we have run a little bit late, questions or comments or anything else.
Great, Alastair, thank you so much for your presentation. It really was exciting to see how EYP actually has taught us already so many things that are relevant for jobs. And yes, guys, if you have any questions, please raise your hands. Use the raise hand function. All of you are the stars of digital sessions, so I'm sure you know how to do it. Okay, so if you don't remember how to do it, you can find it under next to participants. There are 3 dots below, and there should be this function. Yeah, Sabina, great.
Great, got it. Thank you. Hi. I just wanted to ask, because I'm at a very sort of like desperate point in my career, so to speak, which is why this came at a perfect time. And I'm sending like a lot of applications out. And I was wondering what your sort of opinion / stance would be on the division between like quantity and quality. Because everyone says like when you're looking for a job, just apply to as many things as you can, but also tailor your application, put a lot of research and effort into each application. How can you do both at the same time?
I mean, I think you're probably right in that you probably can't. I think part of the problem is that if you're applying to that many things at once, you probably don't have a strong desire to go to any one in particular. And therefore, like, you know, will struggle to say in the, you know, in an application, like, oh yeah, well, this is why I really have a particular passion for this place. but I think it's also okay to have that. Like, obviously, if there's a position that you really want and like you earnestly have an expression where you're like, oh, I would be good at this and this is why, then, you know, I think that that's obviously a useful thing to do. I think if you're in a position where you're applying for things more so because you need to apply for things and need a job or need to move jobs, I do think it's going to be a lot more difficult to sort of tailor what you're saying like to that job. I like personally would go for like the quality over the quantity, but having said that, obviously it's like it depends. Like quality is a luxury, like, and as time goes on, because obviously it's a really difficult time to get jobs at the minute, like exceptionally difficult. So like the quantity thing would become more apparent. I guess the given if so, I would say, yeah, I guess number one, that I would tend towards quality, but obviously that's a luxury. And two, if you're in the position where you're trying to or having to apply for a multitude of things that you're less interested in, there may be other ways that you could make your application stand out. You know, you could, for instance, highlight more like your own skills or like the qualities that you would bring to it, and maybe sort of tailor that to the kind of work, you know, because I imagine it's going to be a struggle to be like, oh, since I was young, I've dreamed of working at company I heard of last week. But that would also, you know, let you send them out kind of like en masse like that with less adjustment, because you could make it, you know, sort of more about yourself and like the sort of strengths that you have, and then sort of tweak those. Do you mind if I ask what sort of roles it is you're applying for, or what industry?
Yeah, I'm going more for like creative industry things, which is absolutely like impossible. But that's my own sort of problem.
Well, that is a tough one to get into, and I think probably all the more reason to lean for like the quantity. But I do also imagine that like with that kind of thing, you're either I assume that you're either going to be looking for like a place that you really want to be at, or it's like a foot in the door kind of thing where really kind of like anything would do. Yeah, so I guess as a third piece of advice, I would say, like, no matter what anyone says about the best way to do an application, I would say try and be genuine in it. Like, don't, if you're not excited about working at that particular company, don't say you are. And if you know, find, there must be some reason that you're applying for it. And I would say, like, find that and just write that large. Like, focus on the thing that you actually do care about. Because in my experience of interviewing people and going through applications, typically, like, the thing that stands out to me very often is like how genuine it comes across, or if they're lying about some skill or experience or something like that. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I hope you find one soon.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, Sarah, great.
Hi. You mentioned that ideally, if you don't have some sort of annual evaluation, that you should try to pursue one and kind of ask your supervisors. And I'm currently working, it's part-time, but nevertheless, and I'm going into a field where this whole idea of speaking with your leaders and having constructive meetings and having meetings at all is very not appreciated, or not something you do to the same extent as I think in many other workplaces. So do you have any tips and tricks to how to, because I think this is very valuable, but I just have no clue how I'm going to go about it, being like, I need someone to talk to, or like, yeah.
Do you know why that is not like a common thing in that workplace?
It's just very weak leadership structures, except like straight authoritarian in the hospitals. So it's more, yeah, sure, you're here, I'm your supervising, like the supervising and tending, but that doesn't give any more than talk to me about what field you're going in, or this is your schedule. And where I'm working currently, it's because it's part-time and so many employees that it's more of a take these 5 shifts and leave me be, or we fucked up your paycheck, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, that's a tricky one. I do have some experience of working in places where I wasn't able to get proper feedback because of the management structure. The things that I relied on at the time were feedback from my peers, actually, like, because I find I wasn't able to get it, or at least I wasn't able to get it honestly, from the people who were meant to be responsible for me. So I ended up actually relying a lot on like peer feedback, and that was actually always pretty informal. Like we would go out for a coffee and just have like a chat about stuff. In terms of getting like more formal feedback and like, you know, annual reviews and stuff, that's gonna be, I can imagine like 2 ways of doing it. One is like you go like a human resources route and like officially ask for it, and I suspect based on what you've told me that would not yield much fruit. The other way of doing it would be, I guess, to try and get it more sort of informal, and like you may struggle, it sounds like, if you like go to someone and say like, yeah, can we have a one-to-one where you give me feedback? So if you could maybe find a way to like sort of, whilst being, because I imagine a part of it is that they have like no time, right? So like finding a way where you can like make it more sort of casual, where you can kind of get bits from them. And I guess also that you can kind of assume that it sounds like in that environment, if no one's coming to you and telling you that something's wrong, then what you're doing is probably okay. Which is probably also like, so there's probably like a background, like base level constant feedback that they're giving to you, that like if you're still employed there and they're not shouting at you, then, you know, maybe things are all right. But that is a difficult one. And it sounds like if the place just doesn't have a culture of that kind of like formalized feedback, it's not necessarily going to be easy to like get one. I would say that probably your best bet would be like talking to peers, or if you can find someone who's in a position to give you feedback, you know, who's like hierarchically, you know, above you, or whose opinion that you respect, see if you can kind of like informally like befriend them and kind of like get them to like help you out with stuff, because it does sound like in that environment you may struggle to get like the formal like actual feedback that you need.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Can I ask, it's a kind of a follow-up question, if you have kind of to getting that momentary, because we're getting sent out many different places, so I don't work with the same people all the time. I've actually never had the same people I work with. So if you have any tips and tricks to being like, hi, I know we're leaving and it's 7 a.m. and we worked the whole night, but can you, like, a better way of asking if there's anything I should improve on, or if I did a good job, or what I can do better, than being like, hi, so did I do, or how was, hi, like better than that.
I see what you mean. I think your instinct there is valid. A lot of time people will become sort of, they will either freeze up or kind of get defensive or quiet if you outright ask them like, did I do a good job? That is a tricky one, which I might need to think about and get back to you on a better answer for. But off the top of my head, I'm thinking that that's kind of almost like a social engineering problem, you know, where you want to be able to like phrase a question in such a way that they'll tell you, you know, how you did. Sometimes whenever I'm having one-to-one meetings with people, and I almost have like an opposite problem where there's people I'm kind of like friendly with in a way that makes it difficult to sort of ask them the more formal questions of how did your week go, or like, you know, how did you feel about that last thing. So like you could experiment with things like, you know, asking them how like their experience of something was, and then if they give you like, you know, instead of saying like how was my whatever, you could ask them how they got on with theirs. And then if you know, depending on what they say, then you could be like, oh, well, you know, I think mine went well, or I think mine went badly. What do you think? And kind of put them in a position where like they'll feel good, like they'll feel like kind of like empowered by the fact that you're asking, rather than like burdened by like the responsibility of like being your feedbacker, if that makes sense. This is the best thing I can think of off the top of my head, but I'll put some thought into that one.
Thank you. No, it makes you put my thoughts into words. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. So we go now to Anastasia and then Marilena.
Okay, so hi. So basically my question, I don't know how to like make sense of it, but essentially is, so I work in an environment where I see that my superior is like not that great at leadership and like leading our team into like cooperating, and like there's problems that need solving, and like I feel like some of the things you've mentioned would perfectly like apply to like solve some of the things that are going on. And I just sometimes, because I'm one of the less experienced workers and also one of the youngest workers, and like my superior is like 8 years older than me, I sometimes don't feel as comfortable to like sort of share knowledge and like transmit it to said superior. And I just wanted to ask if you had like any advice on how to like sometimes share all this knowledge EYP gives us with other people in a way that doesn't feel like you're like, I don't know, like trying to sound like, oh yeah, I have all this skill from this organization. Here you go, use it to make this all better. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but
no, I do. I understand. I can relate to that, because I remember working at a place where I had a truly atrocious manager who was like, apart from being just like ineffective, was like toxic. So like I very often was thinking like, how can I influence these things positively, without sounding like I'm saying I have all the answers? Because I guess there's also, maybe you can relate to this, but I had a problem where I was like, I don't want to frame this as a solution to everything, because in case it's not a solution, then they can come back to me and say, well, why did you suggest something that didn't work? Yeah, fraught with peril. As a caveat, I will say that ultimately what I ended up doing was actually leaving that environment to work somewhere that was more open to like a kind of collaborative process. But things that I did try while I was there, so I did actually try going directly to that manager and saying, I think we should try this. I tried, because my logic at the time was something like given that I planned to eventually quit over the bad management, I was like, well, I may as well, like I may have like said aloud all my ideas for things that are better, so that whenever I do quit, I can be like, well, I did suggest these things that would make it better. Not that quitting should necessarily be like your go-to for all problems, but sometimes it is. Again, so I suppose unlike EYP, sometimes it is actually, you know, a valid option to play. You could, I guess, consider if you could get anyone else in the team open to the idea of changing how things work, then you could try, you know, having some kind of session where everyone can kind of contribute ideas, and then you can include yours in with it, and try and get like, or even if there are other people on the team who you can speak to that you think might agree with some of the ideas that you want to change, and get them on side maybe, because then what I think one of the things that's difficult about this position is if you're sort of approaching it as an individual, because then it's your responsibility, and it's also like sort of your credibility on the line, and it's like it makes you feel like, you know, it's you that they have to personally believe or not believe. So it might be an idea to try and get some of the team members like on side, or have like an open kind of forum where they can also discuss like things that they think would be better. Because if you can get the team to sign up to it, then suddenly it doesn't matter whose original idea it was. And then if you have a whole team of people wanting to do something, it can become easier to like push it through. My other specific advice, I guess I would give you is, and it's not necessarily related to how to solve that problem you're having, but it's just something I want to say. You may in your career find that you're put in positions where you're being told to do something that's impossible, or that you're in a system that's not working. And you may at times believe that it's not possible for a whole system not to work. So actually it must be you individually that are the cause of this thing not working. And I would say to open your mind to the idea that actually you can be in the right, and you can have a whole system above you that's incorrect, that you can have, that just because you've been given an impossible task, you don't have to feel like you personally have failed to do the impossible, because sometimes these things actually are not possible, even though that seems, with your kind of initial outlook, you're like, well, no one would ever ask me to do anything impossible. They sometimes will. And also, just if it's like a toxic environment, just to make sure that you don't let that get to you too much, and try and like keep a focus on what you know is correct.
Thanks.
Good luck with it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alastair. And now let's take a last question from Marilena.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I also study a science subject, and I had some trouble balancing telling recruiters what EYP is and bringing in all the skills and showing them the progression through the years and all that with some, I don't know, the qualifications that they might be looking for, and telling them, oh, I know how to use this and this software and all that stuff. So I was just wanting to hear your advice on balancing these two things.
Yeah, the EYP experience is a really hard one to put on the CV. I struggled with that a lot, like the best way to sort of frame it. I think for the one part, I think it's totally fine to give it like a decent amount of prominence. Like the way that I had my CV structured for the longest time was, educational stuff and qualifications, and then like work experience. And then I had a section at the end where I would describe like volunteer work, which is where I would typically sort of cover the EYP stuff. I suppose that's specific to the way that my CV is set up, because like all the sort of skills that I would list on mine are very specifically technical skills. So maybe for other people, it would be, if you're not having like a technical CV, like it's appropriate whenever you're listing your skills to mention things like, group facilitation and, youth work and stuff. But what I did whenever I was trying to cover it was I tried to avoid describing like what. So I number one, I assumed that the person reading it wouldn't know what EYP was. And I also tried to assume that finding out what EYP was wouldn't necessarily impress them. So like for the longest time, I had like the first two sentences from the EYP website that explain EYP, like literally like in my CV being like, yeah, I did EYP for 4 years. This is what EYP is, which I think doesn't work so well. I think what's better is if you can frame it in a way that they'll sort of understand it, like depending on what the key points for you are. So quite often for me, whenever I was sort of describing EYP stuff on my CV, the key points would be stuff like, oh yeah, well, it's this organization that I worked with that involved like leading teams and collaborating with people and facilitating things, and sort of almost glossing over what the actual purpose of it was, but just focusing very specifically on here are the things that I personally did. Also, just because I knew at that point that as someone sitting across the table, like I'd seen many CVs where people would write, oh, I was a member of, this Scouts brigade or this organization. And honestly, I would quite a lot of the time be like, cool, I wonder what you did there, because you haven't mentioned it. And even if even if I were to look up the organizations, like it wouldn't necessarily tell me. I also try to avoid using EYP terminology, and I try to avoid explaining EYP terminology. So I would quite often on the written CV just like kind of translate it into more kind of like generic terminology. So I would talk about group facilitation rather than sharing, and I would talk about, group discussion rather than committee work, and I would say, like debates rather than general assembly and that kind of thing, and just really sort of translate it into something that someone who may only spend a few seconds looking at each page of the CV would be able to pick up on and be impressed by. And then whenever, if I got to the point of an interview, being able to say, well, EYP is this organization that operates in XYZ countries and we do all these things. And I personally have been involved in all these different roles at all these different events. And sort of save it for that when you actually can sort of explain it to somebody. I don't know if that answers your question or if there was a, cool. I wasn't sure if there was maybe another bit in there that I'd missed.
Oh, and we have one question from Martin. So that should be really the last one.
Oh yeah, in the chat. Okay, yeah.
Martin, you also raised hand, so please speak up.
I'm here now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we are.
Nice. I'll even turn on video for this. I'm curious which of the EYP skills you have been highlighting in what sounds like a tech career. Like which ones are the ones that you've actually pointed out in your applications that seemed relevant to the jobs you applied for?
Yeah, so mostly for me, that was things like planning of events, facilitating group discussions, leading teams, like working in a distributed international team, which is actually something that I was quite often asked in like early job interviews. It was like, do you have any experience working internationally? Conflict resolution, and I would even put things like youth volunteering and youth leadership in there. I suppose really just like the names for all the things that we do that I expected a recruiter might understand, and that I felt that I, was, I think I don't have my current CV handy, but I think that the way I have it summarized at the minute is probably just that I mentioned group facilitation and international work and working with young people. I think were probably the ones that I highlighted. Now for me, that was because I was mostly applying for jobs where I was either going to be managing people or there was the potential to be managing people in the near future. So it was always sort of useful to be able to be like, I have this sort of management experience. But even apart from that, I think things like group facilitation and like experience, like discussing things in a group and debating, I think that always will sell well, because almost in every, and like communication skills even, and like that, like covering like that whole thing, like that is often like I think for almost any role, like that kind of thing will be useful. Even if you're not managing, you'll probably be discussing things at some point. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Alastair. And thank you guys to all of you who came today, who listened to the talk. It was really amazing. I think it was enlightening, and the greatest result we see still everyone is online who joined the talk from the first minute. So Alastair, big compliment to you. We didn't lose anyone. So we even had some people in between who came and and exited the chat. So really great to again have gained some EYP spirit with seeing you guys here, and I hope we'll see each other at some EYP event. Hopefully there will be some soon, but so far the health situation is not that promising. But anyway, definitely let's see each other at least at the digital event. And Alastair, thank you so much for supporting EYP Network still, and I hope to see you at the future alumni events. Yes,
thank you
and
very much for having me.
Yes, the pleasure is all ours. Yes, there will be another few, I think 2-3 alumni talks are still planned this year. So follow our social media and you'll see the updates on them. Thank you so much, guys, and have a nice, relaxing evening.